This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, and Jeanette. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke, and this week we are going to talk about a very broad topic, actually, but we're going to narrow our focus on this topic, and that is the subject of Jinn. Now, in Islam, Jinn are spirits they're often referred to in Western parlance as genies. We talk about the idea of the genie in the bottle. People have ideas of Jinn from the 1001 Nights, the Arabian tales. Tends to be the main, as at least most of the main Western stories about Jinn have come from this source. Jinn are certainly mentioned in the Quran, and Jinn are a type of being that has been said to exist prior to Islam in that particular region of the world where Islam is now prevalent, particularly in the Arabian countries. So what we're going to be looking at today is, because we are focused in this podcast on the dark feminine, I'm going to talk broadly about what Jinn are. I'm going to actually read from an article that summarizes it pretty well. And actually, weirdly, this article actually comes from Adventist literature. But so if I skip over the editorializing of the author, there's a lot of stuff that's just good basic fact there. And it has been researched and it has been sourced from good articles. So I'm going to use that particular basic outline. And then from another source, from the Encyclopedia of Religion, I'm going to talk about the types of Jinn. Now, this can vary, and I know within Islam sometimes it's also seen a little bit differently. I'm going to read one Jinn story, okay, and then based on one particular type of Jinn. And then we're going to talk about the two types of Jinn that are often considered to be feminine. Okay, they're not necessarily feminine. There may be examples, at least in one of the types, of masculine versions as well, or sometimes even versions, it's been suggested, that are androgynous. But nonetheless, there's at least two types that tend to be more associated with the feminine than with masculine types. So those are the ones that I want to focus on for the purpose of this podcast. And then we want to go over the characteristics of those particular Jinn and what are their uniquely defining characteristics, and how does that compare to other types of beings that we see of a similar type, not only within Hinduism, but I think also we can see it within Greek and Roman demonology and things like that, and the kind of things that we later think about as being connected to demonology, and certainly also to Judaism, in terms of how we think about these types of beings. And of course, the monotheistic influence of Islam and its biblical influence, biblical origins, shall we say. The Quran obviously being the third of the books that start with they're all Abrahamic religions in their own way. There's this discussion here of these types of beings and where they fit into a paradigm in which you have one God, in the case of Islam, Allah. So Allah is the one supreme God. So the Jinn, the role of the Jinn and the way that they fit into that Islamic cosmology is also somewhat important here. So with that said, this is not going to be an exhaustive covering of everything having to do with the Jinn. We simply want to look at the way in which aspects of Jinn or certain types of Jinn deal with this dark feminine archetype or these dark feminine have these characteristics that we associate with the dark feminine. So to begin, I'm going to look at, this is Vivian Laughlin's article called A Brief Overview of Al-Jinn Within Islamic Cosmology and Religiosity. So I'm not going to read this word for word. I'm going to read some of it, but this is in a journal. Let's see if I can get this. It was published by Andrews University in 2015 on the Digital Commons, but it looks like this was part of the Journal of Adventist Mission Studies, which I just thought, wow, that's a weird place to find this. But having looked over a number of sources, some of which assume a lot of background and knowledge about the jinn, this is really just meant probably for people who are on missions to understand what the actual origins and background are of this idea. And it does it pretty comprehensively and pretty accurately. Again, minus any kind of editorialization that might go on there, which we will skip over. So she says when the average person hears the term jinn or genie, one often has a vision of a genie living inside a beautiful vase or bottle with a luxurious plush couch and a living area inside of it. Or perhaps even the story of Aladdin comes to mind. Nevertheless, these things come to mind because for centuries of folklore stories that were used to teach about the jinn. I think that's actually a very bad sentence, okay? However, as time went on, the stories changed, thus providing a distortion of the events surrounding jinn. Or perhaps with a more Western perspective, they've become fictionalized. From researching and gathering data from ancient, medieval, and modern contemporary Islamic history, this explains who and what the jinn are and show how they function in traditional or contemporary cosmology and religiosity. Okay. So, the origins here. It is said that the jinn were on Earth before human civilization began. In Islam, it is believed that the jinn were the first creatures created. The jinn are said to have been created long before pre-Islamic Arabia, because this is a quote from somebody else, because the jinn are deemed to be closer to heaven than earth, they are called jinn, deriving their name from the word in Arabic for heaven, jannah. Asad teaches the meaning of jinn from the Quran to be that it has a usage different from that of what they call primitive folklore, the term jinn having several distinct meanings. The most commonly encountered is that of spiritual forces or beings which, precisely because they have no corporeal existence, are beyond the perception of our corporeal senses, a connotation which includes Satan's and satanic forces, as well as angels and angelic forces, since all of them are concealed from our senses. I have talked quite a bit about concealment. In fact, my Monday live stream that is coming up after this podcast is going to be on that very subject on Instagram, probably around 11:30 to noon New York time. So just throwing that in there that you might want to check that out for a discussion of concealment. In order to make it quite evident that these invisible manifestations are not of corporeal nature, the Quran states parabolically that the jinn were created out of the fire of scorching winds, or out of a confusing flame of fire, or simply out of fire. Okay, yeah, so jinn are beings that come from fire, particularly from smoke. So they're fire beings, but they're also air beings at the same time. Okay, because jinn were created from fire, this great difference created a boundary between humans and jinn, thus making the jinn feel superior to humans. This superiority complex created a great defiance, forever changing the world of Islam. Okay, so it says, so she talks about this great defiance of the jinn. As aforementioned, the Quran teaches that jinn pre-existed human beings. But since the jinn were not doing as Allah intended, he removed the evil jinn from the earth and then proceeded to create the Garden of Eden, and then the traditional Christian creation story from which was later derived. Well, really, Jewish creation story that later becomes a Christian, and the Islamic creation story. However, the angels saw one jinn in particular, which was an orphan, and took pity on him and decided to bring him up to heaven to reside with them. This orphan jinn's name was Iblis, which we commonly know as Satan. Okay, we'll talk a little about Iblis in a moment. According to the Quran, Satan was never actually an angel, but rather a jinn. Angels are made from light and jinn are made from fire. Okay, so there's a difference that is, at least in this cosmological thinking, that exists. As the story continues, Allah finished creating the Garden of Eden and made Adam and Eve. Allah then designated that Adam would reign over all things on earth. Allah commanded that all of the angels and Iblis were to prostrate themselves before Adam. They all prostrated themselves, save Iblis, who refused and gloried in his arrogance. He thus became one of those that deny the truth. Now, let me stop here for a moment, because that is not the only story of Iblis. Iblis is, this is one version of the story, that Iblis is arrogant and won't bow down. Other stories of Iblis suggest that he loves God so much, or loves Allah so much, that he can't bear to bow to anyone but God. Nonetheless, he is disobedient by not doing what Allah says or what God says. So therefore, he is cast out. So there's different inflections in here. You do see Islamic stories that show a little more sympathy for Iblis than the folklore around Satan. And I say folklore because the fall of Satan does not actually appear in the Bible. I mean, there's references to the idea of the fall of Lucifer, but that's generally not, it's not actually referring to Lucifer. That's actually referring to a Babylonian king. But that is an event that's not really, it's talked around, but not really discussed in the Bible. It's only in the apocryphal literature where we actually see this idea of a fall, particularly in Enoch, where you actually see this idea appearing. So to go back to what this article is saying, Iblis's defiance of Allah's order inadvertently resulted in his removal from heaven, never being able under any circumstances to return again. And they're saying that in the Quran, it says, I am better than he, thou hast created me out of fire, whereas thou hast created him out of clay. Allah said, down with thee then from this state, for it is not meet for thee to show arrogance here. Go forth then, verily, among the humiliated shalt thou be. Okay, so this is a different version of the idea of the fall. And so it says, upon Iblis's departure, he asked Allah if he could live until the day of judgment. Allah granted Iblis's request. Said Iblis, grant me a respite till the day when all shall be raised from the dead. Many Muslims believe that it was during Iblis's defiant fall when evil completely took over his entire being. However, when Iblis asked Allah for life until the day of judgment, is how the Jinn became immortal. Or in theory immortal, because if there is an end time, then obviously Iblis will end as well, at least according to that idea. Because if you were immortal, it means that no day of judgment won't apply to you either. Okay. In Iblis's anger, he began to attempt to argue with God and say harsh, threatening words. Whereupon Iblis said, now that thou hast thwarted me, I shall most certainly lie in ambush for them all along thy straight way, and shall most certainly fall upon them openly, as well as a manner beyond their ken, and from their right and their left, most of them thou will find ungrateful. So, in other words, he's now decided that since he has had this fall, that he is going to be in defiance of God, which is a very similar idea that we see in like Milton's Paradise Lost and different things that talk about the idea of Satan becoming the enemy of God, which is, by the way, not the original role of Satan. We'll talk more about that. But Iblis is this satanic figure within Islam. At least in one place I've seen that might be a contraction of Diablos, where we get Iblis. That this may actually be a contraction because Diablos is an adversary, one who opposes. And so we'll look at some of the etymologies, but yeah. So Iblis is said to be was said to be a jinn and not an angel proper. Okay, at least this is this idea that we see here. So, okay, having to do with jinn now. Since the great defiance of Iblis, jinn are not inhabitants of the earth in quite the same manner as humans. Jinn are the inhabitants of the subtle and immaterial or subtly material world. Alam al-Malakut. Okay, so Malkut is really, that is kind of the manifestation of the world, but I guess there's an idea that there's one of the more subtle regions of that. Into which the material and physical world is plunged as if into a liquid. It says this is another quote, if we picture a room in our mind, the medium in which that imagined room exists supports form, but itself is subtle. It is the alum al-malakut. In traditional cosmology, the physical world is a crystallization or projection of the subtle world or ether. The ether is a projection out of the surrounding formless or angelic world, and the angelic world is projected out of being. Yeah, this is Kabbalistic stuff, but I'm not going to divert into that right now. Jinn are said to be the inhabitants of the subtle world,
some of whom are non-central beings like the non-human creatures of this world, while others are central beings like humans. Okay, this is the idea that humans are above animals or other creatures. Jinn have free will, are endowed with an intellect, and are capable of grasping reality. Thus, some argue that they are capable, if you're looking at it from that perspective, of being saved. And certainly, I think there is a reference in the Quran to jinn listening to Muhammad and converting to the true religion and so forth. So, yeah, there's the idea that because jinn have an intellect, that they have free will. And so, therefore, they are capable of choosing good or evil by this theology. Okay, so it says sometimes their religions correspond to religions of humans. And so that would also imply, though, that if they are living in this kind of subtle body, that they also are living life in the same way that humans do, which is interesting. Okay, now she talks about the similarities between jinn and human beings. While the world of the jinn is generally believed to be perfectly parallel to the human world, the primary difference is that jinn are able to move between their world and ours, while humans cannot perform this task. Although the difference in nature between a jinn and a human is quite clear, the jinn, after Iblis was evicted from heaven, are further subject to limitations that humans are also limited by. The jinn cannot hear what goes on in heaven or see heaven. The jinn, once upon a time, were able to fly up and enter heaven whenever they liked, but they are no longer able to enter heaven, and they're no longer able to hear what is discussed. Furthermore, they are no longer able to know anything about destiny. Those powers were removed when Iblis was evicted from heaven. They are nonetheless still represented as being perfectly capable of rising up to heaven without divine assistance. The divine guard at the gates of heaven requires all of its powers, launching them against fiery traces, or shihab, to throw them back to earth and prevent them from collecting the secrets of the future. Jinn are believed to be both less virtuous and less physical than humans, but like humans, endowed with the ability to choose between good and evil. The jinn, like human Muslims, are required to worship Allah and follow Islam. The Quran states, "He governs all that exists from the celestial space to the earth, and in the end shall ascend unto him for the judgment day, the length of which will be like 1,000 years of reckoning." Okay, this sounds a lot like stuff we see in the book of Revelation, too, which, of course, is an earlier work, as the Quran is written somewhere around, I can never remember the exact date in my mind, but it's basically the 600s CE, 600s Common Era, which would be about roughly 600 years after what we think of as the Christian biblical texts being written, 500 to 600 years after that. So we have this idea of jinns. Okay, so let's talk about it says some jinn will actually marry humans, and yes, we are going to talk about that. And they can have interactions with human beings. Now, Islam specifically does, obviously, as you might imagine, forbid humans from interacting with jinn or seeking help from jinn the way that pre-Islamic people would propitiate or ask jinn for assistance in particular matters, particularly in magical workings, to assist them with some endeavor that they were doing. They would ask the power of the jinn. They would ask for their help. And obviously, we're not understood in pre-Islamic Arabia as having this connection to this Islamic theology, obviously, because it's obviously pre-Islam. So we can see a bit of a parallel here between the idea of a daemonic being, Daemonic, daemonic, which were originally conceived of as intermediaries between gods and men, as Plato discusses in particular, that these intermediary spirits then later on, when you have the arrival of monotheistic religions, become interpreted as demonic in a negative sense, in the sense that they are somehow evil, or they are tricksters, or they are there to create some kind of harm or deception to humanity. And this, of course, is not what the original sense of them, that's not the original sense of them. That's not what they were. So just like with the idea that previously one would reach out to their daemon or to a daemonic being, by the way, daemonic forces were also often considered to be psychological forces. So you will see things like I did a podcast on mania. Okay, mania, being a certain mental state, states having to do with extreme wrath or extreme anger or extreme mental confusion or, irrationality, I guess we would call it, were attributed to daemons. and very extreme emotions. So, as I say, certain psychological states or feelings were also attributed to daemons in ancient Greece, as well as beings that were helpful, that were those there to guide you, to be almost kind of a spirit guide type idea, or the idea people think of now as a guardian angel type being. And this is frequently why I will say that there is actually very little difference between demons and angels. Something that people who are really into angels and angel stuff get very annoyed with me for, but it is a fact. I mean, they are very much a similar type of being. It's just that one is working with what we think of as the supreme being in this monotheistic context, and the others are assumed to be working against the supreme being. So there's this kind of cosmological warfare that's created that did not originally exist. Okay, so let's get back to the powers of the jinn. That which clearly distinguishes jinn from humans are powers and abilities. Muslims believe that God has given them these powers as a test for them. If they oppress others with them, they will be held accountable. Because Muslims know and believe in the jinn's powers, they can often make sense of the many mysteries that happen in our world. One of the powers of the jinn is they are able to take on any physical form they like, so they have a shape-shifting ability. So they can appear as humans, animals, trees, or anything else. The ability to possess and take over minds and bodies of other creatures is also power that a jinn are said to have greatly utilized over the centuries. Yeah, and you even to this day still hear about the idea, particularly of women who are said to be possessed by jinn. And if we think about them in the daemonic sense, I almost feel like this is back to that whole idea of women who are expressive of either emotion, strong emotion, or women who are expressive of some kind of rebellion, say, against whatever the social order is, are perhaps considered to be possessed by a jinn, right? And so this is something to think about. Think about the psychology of that, and also what the social implication is of that. So jinn, in folk Islam, jinn are spirits invoked for magical purposes and often held responsible for miraculous or unusual events for a wider range of illnesses, which are popularly believed to have been caused by an imbalance between internal and external jinn. It sounds very Aristotelian in a weird way. Healers often speak directly to jinn prior to driving them out of patients. Okay, and she talks particularly here about Sufi spiritual healing, in which the Sufi is said to talk to a jinn to make it leave a person who is possessed. It says, now, of course, why do they possess them? They said sometimes there's both good or bad jinn, because they believe there are both types, because they have free will. They may possess people for a wide variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because the jinn or its family has been hurt accidentally. They could have fallen in love with the person. Most of the time they say it occurs because the jinn are simply malicious and wicked. I guess they're just having a laugh. So, for example, it says a legend has it that if Sufis are considered to have divine powers they have received from the jinn, since they serve as intermediaries between humans and the jinn. Now, this is interesting because now, in this case, the Sufi is the intermediary. Sufis being, of course, Islamic mystics, and they have all of the characteristics that we have with general mysticism. I'm thinking a lot about this subject because I have students doing papers on them and asking me questions about what the definition of mysticism is, because if you go and look it up, it'll say, well, there's a whole wide variety of definitions. But mysticism primarily has to do with direct experience of the divine. So there's no intermediary. Okay, so the Sufi, in theory, would be someone who can directly connect through Allah, and not necessarily one that would go to a mosque and have an imam or another spiritual leader mediate that interaction between themselves and the divine. And of course, they also practice certain types of spiritual healing and things that are considered to be outside the mainstream of Islam and might be accepted by some factions and very much frowned upon by others. Because there are some Sufis that are persecuted for their practices because they have this direct contact with Allah. They first of all they're not going to be as bound by the rules and strictures of the Quran. I mean, they are and they aren't. They're not as, and we would say it would be, if we compare them to Christian mystics, this would be somebody who's not dogma driven. Okay, their understanding of the divine is a bit more. If they have indeed had this direct experience of the divine, you realize you're dealing with something that is outside of rules, images, and limitations that people create within these religious organizations. This is the reason a lot of religious organizations don't want you to practice mysticism if you're drawn in that direction, because they want to be the ones to mediate and apply the rules and kind of keep you in your place socially if you engage in these things. In the same way, like I always talk about with Tantra, with Hinduism, now you're going outside the structure of, in that case, of the Vedas and of the society and perhaps even of the caste system. So now, those categories and hierarchies don't have a meaning. So the mystic is somebody who is dangerous because they transcend those hierarchies, or they get outside those hierarchies. But some of them, I'm going to actually be doing a series on Christian mystics, female Christian mystics, in the beginning of 2024 by Patreon request. And we're going to talk a bit about the way in which mysticism itself is considered to be sometimes an act of rebellion. And, certainly within Christianity, it depends. Sometimes it led to people being declared saints or doctors of the church, and other people who were not so fortunate or didn't toe the line sufficiently might be considered heretics and might have been burned or hanged. Yeah, there's this, the relationship with God there's often an intermediary, but interestingly here they're saying that the Sufi is acting as the intermediary between the jinn and a human being. So let's talk a little bit about evil jinn here. She mentions evil jinn manipulate people through visions in which they seek to lead people away from the worship of Allah. Okay, yeah, this is like the same crap that you hear about when people start practicing religions other than the monotheisms. Oh, you're going to leave Christianity. That's because you're being led away by some vision. Yeah, you hear that. That's often used to scare people back into falling into line with the religion. I mean, let's be real. Some people are delusional, but and maybe going down a track that isn't good for them. But I would say when it comes to the mainstream or mainline religion saying, you shouldn't go off in this direction, I would say, I haven't, nobody studied this, I guess. You can't give a percentage. But I feel like a lot of the time you are dealing with people who, as I've always called, are the fence jumpers, the people who don't want to stay confined in the box of traditional religion. It may be more harmful for them to stay in the box of traditional religion because they're either going to be put down, oppressed because of whatever status they have in the religion. It could be for a lot of reasons. Women have debilitated status in monotheistic religions a lot of the times. And yes, I know somebody's going to try to argue with me and go, no, that's not always true. Yes, it is. Women are expected. Women's status comes from their ability to be obedient. So it's definitely not a religion that necessarily exalts women. You don't see in the monotheisms some of them. Judaism is a little more, certain progressive forms of Judaism, you'll certainly see like female rabbis and things like that. But in very, very traditional forms of those religions, women are typically second-class citizens. And, this happens in other religions too. It's not just monotheisms, but it's really prevalent in monotheism. So especially when you see women, maybe that's probably why a lot of women were accused mainly of witchcraft, even if men also practiced things, because they felt like, you're trafficking in powers that are not the ones we told you that you can traffic in. So that's, again, you reaching out and kind of trying to interact with nature, interact with the forces of the world on your own, rather than having somebody else tell you the right way to do it. So you can argue amongst yourselves about whether that's good to do or not good to do. My personal opinion is that it matters. It's on an individual basis. Some people really need the structure of those hierarchical religions and flourish within them. Other people, it does nothing but oppress the soul and oppress their whole being and what they have to express. So they're actually better to get away from it and go do some exploring on their own and have some of their own direct experiences. But again, it can very much vary by individual. Okay, so let's talk about evil jinn here. Okay, we're continuing to talk about this. Only by having a knowledge of the world of the jinn and a commitment to Allah can a person fight off being led astray. In visions given by evil jinn, they often take the form of people's parents, thereby convincing many souls of the dead that the souls of the dead people are still present among the people of the earth. Yeah, and that gets into the afterlife theology about, people don't come back. They either go to heaven or hell or wherever else, purgatory if they believe in that or whatever. Yeah, that's certainly part of the theology of a lot of monotheistic religion, particularly within Christianity and Islam. As mentioned above, Iblis has set out on a mission to corrupt the earth and its inhabitants as much as possible. One way Iblis does this is through body possession, and not only humans, but also animals, trees, and other objects. By possessing people or objects, evil jinn hope to cause people to worship others besides God. Yes, we see how terrible that is, right? Which is one of the worst offenses you could commit. Well, probably within that theological context, yeah, but in the broader spectrum, probably not. Yeah, so anyway, this is what they're talking about now. The evil jinn, so it's the idea of possessing people to turn them down another path, or perhaps we could say turn them on perhaps a destructive path. Now, the good jinn, if we look at this, because they have the right to choose between good and evil, it makes the jinn more widely accepted within the Muslim religious tradition. Muslims feel to try to ignore or avoid them is to invite defeat, loss of health, and even death. Jinn are mentioned numerous times within various parts of the Quran and have an entire surah written about them, Surah 72. Although Muslims believe in jinn as a whole and accept them as part of their religion and religious practices, it does not mean that they are not aware of evil works of the jinn. Okay, so it says, so she talks about how good jinn can also possess somebody, and the major difference is that Muslims welcome possession by good jinn. When possessed, a person is said to be worn by or to wear a jinn. Some Muslims who are possessed feel that it is a great honor to be chosen and possessed by good jinn. It is as much of an honor to wear a hijab, the female head covering, as it is to wear a jinn. Humans may also have friendships with jinn. Most jinn possessions are by male jinn who possess a human female. However, the female jinnia are believed to be particularly forceful and persuasive in pursuing a love affair with the human man. Rothenberg's research found that the jinn wear all people, but the majority are women. Okay, 60 or 70% of women, 10 to 15% are children, and the rest are men. There are more women worn by the jinn because they are jealous of each other. If a woman is married to a man that another woman loves, that other woman will make magic for the first one, and so on. In most cases, the jinn comes by magic, rarely for revenge. Okay, so they say that jinns can also engage in good deeds. Okay, so I think we've got enough of the background here about what jinn are. They come from the element of fire, but they are spirits of air. So they're like the spirits of the smoke of fire, which is a lot of times when you see the old motif of the genie coming out of the bottle, it's like this is a being of air. This is a wispy being that comes out, and there may be a fire that comes with the genie. Now we want to talk about the different types of jinn. So this is actually from the Encyclopedia of Religion. And I'm going to actually read the whole thing here so we can have a broader context than just what the Adventists might think. The most widespread figures in Islamic demonology are the jinn, or D-G-I-N-N, or jinn without the D. They are ontologically intermediate, somewhat like the Greek daimonia, as I mentioned, and the Judeo-Christian angels and devils. According to the Quran, their bodies are created of smokeless flame, while human bodies came from clay and angelic bodies from light. Jinns are of both sexes. Given their ethereal composition, jinns are normally imperceptible to humans, but may become perceptible in a variety of guises, including giants, dwarves, or animals. Dwarves is interesting. So there's this connection of them to certain types of fairy folk. In pre-Islamic Arabia, jinns were desert beings like nymphs and hostile to humans. They were gradually, quote-unquote, spiritualized. By Muhammad's time, Arabs of Mecca were sacrificing to them and seeking their favor. Okay, so there we go. They're natural forces in the same way that daemons are. Nymphs and satyrs represent forces of the water, of the forests, of the fields, of sexuality. But it's interesting because they perceive them as hostile. I think it's more that one has to be very careful how they approach these kinds of beings. Anybody who deals in what we'll call the daemonic rather than the demonic, I mean, some people don't, there may not be that much of a difference, but if you're dealing in the world of these types of spirits, as a practicing magician, or even as just somebody who is a practicing pagan, like old school pagan, you know that this potentially, it always has the potential to be a dangerous relationship, but that these beings can be offered things, and so it's always this kind of tit for tat relationship. Here, I'll do this thing for you if you do this thing for me, and this is very typical of pact making, and it's definitely the old school way of doing things before we had this idea of ethical religion. There's this idea, this priest-philosophical version of religion was definitely about this kind of give and take between the forces of nature. I mean, they're forces that you live with, and you're figuring out how to live in a society with them. Now with the biblical idea that the forces of nature are separate from us, that our mind, that our intellect somehow makes us superior or over or dominating of nature, we function completely, almost completely alienated from it, because we are so up in our heads and our minds about how we interact with everything. Everything has to be interpreted according to some kind of rational process, and that does separate you from the thing that you're encountering. I mean, there's still a part of you that will recognize the encounter, but we tend to try to write it off, explain it away, or make it an emotional response. We try to find a way to stuff down or to repress that kind of interaction a lot of the times, because we're fearful of it, because we don't understand it, because we have lost the ability to understand that over time. Again, unless you have taken initiations in certain types of currents, or if you have managed to work your way through magical practices and experimented with this sort of thing, maybe gotten your fingers burned a few times, but working with these types of beings. If this is something that you do, and this is what you are drawn to, instead of the more traditional religions, although you also see examples of this being merged with aspects of traditional religion for people, because people may draw from from a very old school tradition, and then they may also draw from the what we think of as the institutional religious traditions that grew up throughout Europe. It all depends on your connection to that. A lot of people, even people who are in esoteric practice, still don't necessarily have that connection. Their connection still may be too cerebral. It may still be too much up in the head, and too much in the analysis, and not in the allowing oneself to experience. Anyway, that's kind of a long diversion. So let's talk about the Jinn. Let's go back here. Jinns have a social organization and family life, and interact variously with humans, including through romantic love and intermarriage. They can be contacted through various forms of magic and may respond favorably, but can also be easily offended and will react accordingly. At times, they behave playfully, teasing and tricking humans. Jinns are prominent in folklore, popular magic, and literature from the 1001 Nights onward. The notion of jinn has been transmitted from Arabia to non-Arabic centers of Islamic culture, where it blends variously with local traditions about spirits. Now, and as we can tell from the description here, this reminds us a lot of fairy folk in particular. Are jinns fairies? Well, I mean, you could probably make arguments in various directions. They definitely do seem to be elemental in nature, which I do believe does connect them to fairy folk and nature spirits, although I don't think they're characterized that way in this particular part of the world. But there certainly is a relationship in terms of function. Okay, now here we are. Subclasses of the jinn are the Ghul, the Si'lat, and the Ifrit. For ancient Arabs, the Ghul, so it's Ghul with a dot under the H and a line over the U. This from the this actually is probably the origin of the English word ghoul, Ghoul, was a shape-shifting being who lived in desert wastes and led travelers astray. The ghoul may be male or female. According to differing traditions, the Si'lat may either be a female ghoul or a kind of witch among the ghouls. Some writers maintain that men can sire children on a Si'lat but not on a ghoul. In popular usage, the ghoul may designate a human or demonic cannibal. This usage has inspired English and French concepts of ogres and vampires. Okay, so we see the connection here with the jinn, particularly with the ghoul. The Ifrit is a powerful, cunning, frightening jinn, and may also be thought to be identical to a marid. Alternatively, one may be more powerful than the other. So Ifrits and marid, they seem to be sometimes interchangeable. There's probably somebody who knows what the difference is supposed to be. Nevertheless, they're both very powerful types of jinn and generally are not very favorably induced towards people. Okay, so moving on here. The shaitan for pre-Islamic Arabs was a jinn, a kind of genie or genius, a guardian spirit who was sometimes good, sometimes evil. Okay. Shaitan, this may sound like something to you. I'll just continue with this entry because it will explain. It was sometimes good, sometimes evil. As a tutelary spirit, it was also called the Karin. It was responsible for inspiration of all sorts and human progress in general, but particularly for poetic inspiration. Actually sounds a little bit like the Morrigan to some degree. But the shaitan could also be a rebellious jinn, thus an evil spirit or demon. In Islamic usage, the singular al-shaitan is a personal name paralleling Jewish and Christian references to Satan. Yeah, shaitan, shin teth nun would be the Hebrew letters, and shaitan is the Arabic pronunciation of that word. This figure is also named Iblis, as we just talked about, and here they say possibly a contraction of Diablos. The epithets include Adu Allah, enemy of God, and Al-Adu, and I'm not sure if I'm saying those words right, so apologies if I'm not, but that also just means the idea of the enemy. The Islamic Satan resembles the Christian and late Jewish figure as portrayed in the two Testaments and in the Apocrypha, such as the life of Adam and Eve. Okay, and the two Testaments, so the Old and New Testament, I'm also thinking of the Testament of Solomon, which I have referred to in the past, where Solomon commands the demons to build the temple, and according to the Islamic version of that, they said it's actually he is commanding the Jinn. So here we see this connection between Jewish demonic figures and forces that we would see in the Goetia and the Jinn. Areas of uncertainty or disagreement about Iblis or Al-Shaitan remain in Muslim commentary, especially regarding whether he is an angel, malak, or a jinn. Angels are considered ontologically sinless by some and have other characteristics incompatible with Iblis's fundamental rebelliousness and even his physical makeup as presented in the Quran. Also unclear is the exact nature of his sin, particularly the relation between his pride and his disobedience. Yeah, and that's probably because there is this story about Iblis having such a great love of Allah. Okay, so this is one thing. Now here's another thing I would like to just read quickly about this. It says, Jinn are created out of a single element, fire, but associated with deserts, ruins, and other eerie places, and might assume such forms as those of animals, serpents, and other creeping things. But the Jinn are not necessarily evil like devils or shaitans who prompt human beings to evil. Okay, this is actually another entry. I think this is one on devils in the Encyclopedia of Religion. One of them, there's two different entries, and I forget what the first one was, but they're both related to this idea of the Jinn, and they're talking about it in two ways. So this one is suggesting that shaitans are always evil. The other is saying that they're not necessarily always evil. You know, it's this. The reality is that when we talk about things in very, very strictly good and evil terms, that I think is more when one tries to establish this idea of a universal God that is all good. That therefore, theologically, one has to take everything not connected to that and spin it as being part of something that's either evil or deceptive or lesser or something of that nature. So, again, dependent on obedience. So rebellion is considered to be an act of evil in this case. And certainly we know that the whole satanic idea, regardless of whether you see Satan as this testing figure, this adversarial figure, this role that's played on behalf of the divine, or if you see it as this adversary that is opposed to the divine, you have this idea of either rebelliousness or quelling rebelliousness, which was actually the Satan's original role, weirdly enough. According to one tradition, the species, which may use genies as a convenient westernized rubric, is made up of 5 orders. In this case, they're saying the Jan, the Jinn, the Shaitans, the Ifrits, and the Marids. Okay, so this one separates the two. The last are said to be the most powerful, and the first the least. Shaitan is generally used to signify any evil genius. An Ifrit is a powerfully evil genius, while a Marid, as indicated, is an evil genius of the most powerful class. At this point, it should be noted that sources admit some confusion between Jan and Jinn. It is held that Jan are transformed Jinn, just as certain apes and swine were transformed men. It is also admitted that the two are often used indiscriminately as names for the whole species, whether good or bad. As for the characteristics of Jinn, they are of different shapes, appearing as serpents, scorpions, lions, wolves, jackals, and so on. They are of land, sea, and air, and either have wings that allow them to fly, move like snakes or dogs, or move about like men. So now we've got this particular information about the different types. So what we're going to focus on here now are the ghouls, or the ghuli, and we're also going to focus on the Si'lat. So I'm going to read you one quick story, and this is of a very archaic translation of the Arabian Nights, or the 1001 Nights. And this is the story of the envious vizier and the prince and the ghuli, or the Gulah, sorry. The way they have this written, it's weird, but I think it's Gulah. Okay, so this is a continuation. Obviously, like within the 1001 Nights, there's a stories or nested within stories within stories. So this one, we're just going to read it just as it appears, and it's fairly short. The king above mentioned had a son who was ardently fond of the chase, and he had a vizier whom he charged to be always with this son wherever he went. One day the son went forth to hunt, and his father's vizier was with him. And as they rode together, they saw a great wild beast, upon which the vizier exclaimed to the prince, "Away after this wild beast!" The king's son pursued it until he was out of the sight of his attendants, and the beast also escaped before his eyes in the desert. And while the prince wandered in perplexity, not knowing whether to direct his course, he met in his way a damsel who was weeping. He said to her, "Who art thou?" And she answered, "I am a daughter of one of the kings of India. I was in the desert, and slumber overtook me, and I fell from my horse in a state of insensibility, and being thus separated from my attendants, I lost my way." The prince, on hearing this, pitied her forlorn state, and placed her behind him on his horse. As they proceeded, they passed by a ruin, and the damsel said to him, "O my master, I would alight here for a little while." The prince therefore lifted her from his horse at this ruin, but she delayed so long to return that he wondered wherefore she had loitered so, and entering after her without her knowledge, perceived that she was a Gulah, and heard her say, "My children, I have brought you today a fat young man," on which they exclaimed, "Bring him into us, O mother, that we may fill our stomachs with his flesh." When the prince heard their words, he felt assured of destruction. The muscles of his sides quivered, and fear overcame him, and he retreated. The Gulah then came forth, and seeing that he appeared alarmed and fearful, and that he was trembling, said to him, "Wherefore thou dost fear?" He answered, "I have an enemy of whom I am in fear." The Gulah said, "Thou assertest thyself to be a son of a king." He replied, "Yes." Then said she, "Wherefore dost thou not give some money to thine enemy, so conciliate him?" He answered, "He will not be appeased with money, nor with anything but life, and therefore do I fear him. I am an injured man." She then said, "If thou be an injured man, as thou affirmest, beg aid of God against thy oppressor, and he will avert from thee the mischievous design, and that of every other person whom thou fearest." Upon this, therefore, the prince raised his head towards the heaven and said, "O thou who answerest the distressed when we pray to thee, and dispelleth evil, assist me, and cause my enemy to depart from me, for thou art able to do whatever so thou wilt." And the Gulah no sooner heard his prayer that she departed from him. The prince then returned to his father and informed him of the conduct of the vizier, upon which the king gave orders that the minister should be put to death. Okay, so this is the story. So this is a story of a Gulah, and as we see, this is a female Gulah. And what is she doing here? She lures him in with a story. She pretends to be a victim. It takes the form of a beautiful woman. Tells him, I was left behind. And so they go to this. It's this ruin. Okay, so we know that the ghouls manifest in ruins. And she says, let me get off here for a minute. And then she disappears for a while, and then it turns out that she has children, okay, of some kind, and tells them that she's brought this man to feast upon, to cannibalize. Although, whether it's cannibalism, because they're not really the same type of being, in any case, it tends to be viewed because they're taking human forms as cannibalism. And it's funny, because she actually instructs him, well, if you have an enemy, then pray to that, pray to God, and of course, so she does that, and then she leaves. So in a way, she just kind of screwed herself out of whatever it was she was trying to do. So I don't know, there's this kind of fine line between, was she there to just manipulate him, or was she actually also trying to help him? That's kind of a weird story when you think about it, because you would think if she was trying to trick him, she wouldn't tell him to do that. She would tell him to do something else that would just, make his situation worse for him. But in any case, we have this idea of this is a story of a Gulah. Now there's just one thing here about this. It says about the Jinn and about ghouls in particular. It says they may be thought to haunt burial grounds and many other places, but they are fiery spirits and not dead people. Ghouls are monsters thought to haunt cemeteries and feed on dead bodies. An Ifrit mentioned in the Quran as one of the Jinn in the 1001 Nights. The story of the second Sheikh. It is said that a benevolent Muslim woman turned into an Ifrita, a Jinniya. She changed her shape, saved her husband from drowning by carrying him on her shoulders, and told him that she had delivered him from death by the grace of God, since she believed in him and his prophet. Okay. And it says, in Egypt, the word Ifrit came to mean the ghost of a man who had been murdered or suffered a violent death. Okay, so this is just more, we're kind of seeing the intersections between these various subtypes of Jinn. So this was the idea of a woman becoming an Ifrit, an Ifrit. It's trying to get my pronunciations right here. And again, apologies to those who are proficient in Arabic, because I am not. So I'm just doing the best I can. Okay, so the Si'lat or Si'lat. It says, okay, so let's talk about, I couldn't find a particular story of the Si'lat, although I'm sure they exist from somewhere. But here's what's said. This is actually from Amira El-Zain's Islam's Arabs and the Intelligent World of the Jinn, which is a Syracuse University Press 2009. Okay, she says in her notes at the end, the Si'lat resembles the ghoul in many aspects. She too is a temptress, a first-class trickster. She likes dancing relentlessly with men and playing with them as a cat plays with a mouse. People in medieval Islam told stories the Si'lat would attract a man to her by imitating a woman's voice and screaming that a wolf is eating her. The pre-Islamic Arabs maintained that one of their forefathers, Amir ibn Yarbu, I think is how you say that, Amir ibn Yarbu, I think that's right, fell in love with a Si'lat. He married her and she gave birth to human children. There was even the belief an entire Arabian tribe sprang from this marriage. Whether this fictional ancestry was originally regarded as an honor or dishonor, however, is not recorded. The tribe was called Banu Si'lat, children of Si'lat. It is alleged that this eerie Si'lat one day saw lightning in the sky and interpreted it as a sign that her clan was calling her back. So she left her children and husband and returned to her clan. The difference between a Si'lat and a ghoul remains indistinct. Some texts mention that the Si'lat acts in broad daylight, while the ghoul manifests only in the night. Others relate that the fire a ghoul kindles in the night is different from the fire kindled by a Si'lat. This difference is refined between these classes of jinn by some of them claiming that the ghoul's wife is a Si'lat. Yeah, so is she the Si'lat a wife of a ghoul? Is the Si'lat just a very beautiful human figure? She goes on in her notes and says, the indecision with regard to the gender of both Si'lat and ghoul might suggest the possibility of androgyny. Okay, well, I haven't seen a story about that, but obviously there's probably more out there than I've able to see in this period of time. Some supernatural beings, such as the phoenix and dragon, are considered androgynous across cultures. It is this characteristic that partly gives them mythical attributes. Indeed, androgynous beings are looked at as perfect beings that existed before time, before the partition of life into masculine and feminine. One could also find that sometimes Si'lat and ghoul are associated with womanhood rather than androgyny. Alone in the desert, a Si'lat keeps changing shape until she manages to draw a man to her. Iraqi historian Mahmoud Shukri al-Alusi recounts the Arabs call any attractive, witty and powerful woman a Si'lat. Interesting, right? And seductive powers of the senses and the realm of illusions. These kinds of associations indicate a negative approach to women perceived as inconstant, unfaithful, and as bringers of death. It is possible to compare it to the Hindu Maya as the destructive and seductive power of the senses and illusion. Okay, so we have quite a bit to play with here. So what I want to do now is I'm going to finish up and focus by first focusing on some of these aspects of both the Ghula and the Si'lat. Okay, we want to see what the kind of the main attributes there that are relevant to our subject. So first of all, the idea of the ghoul or the Ghula as being cannibalistic, or as being devouring at least, one that will devour human flesh. Now we have seen other examples of this. We've seen, I'm thinking of Black Annis, for example, in English folklore, who is the hag who actually lures children in, not only cannibalizes them, but then wears their skins. So there's this idea of this female figure that is devouring of flesh. But also you have this idea of this power of seduction, the female trickster. As we say with the Si'lat, they say any kind of woman who is attractive, slim, or witty, or powerful is called a Si'lat. So there's this idea that she's not really a real human, but that she's this type of jinn. And which again is not unusual when you're talking about something that that is patriarchal, or that is at least around some kind of very strong social structure. I'm thinking of how in India, a girl who is not necessarily wants to do her own thing and isn't necessarily obedient to the will of her parents is called the Chundi. And Chundi, of course, as we know, is the word for furious. It's that aspect of Durga that is a warrior aspect, and that it is angry against certain aspects of the Asuras. And so but instead that's referred to almost as a negative, like, if you call a woman Chundi, that's not considered to be a compliment. Similarly, this is probably also meant as an insult. because the implication is that you are a woman who is inconstant, or, because you are rebellious against the order, that you are leading someone to death. Now, you do see things like this in Judaism as well. In Proverbs, I want to say it was around Proverbs 5. I don't have the exact quote in front of me. I do have it discussed in my book, Death and the Maiden. I do mention the idea that in Proverbs they talk about the loose or the foreign woman, okay, who will, quote unquote, lead the man down to Sheol with her seduction and with her charms. But there's always the implication of this foreignness there, or this otherness. So here, when you talk about the Jinn, you're talking about the woman who is other. She's not human. She's part of this these fiery elemental type spirits. And again, we can see a parallel that we can draw here between succubi and other kinds of female temptress spirits. There is another place that I saw described. I think it's Encyclopedia Britannica mentions this. I'm just going to read this really quick. It says, the ghoul in popular legend, a demonic being believed to inhabit burial grounds and other deserted places. In Arabic folklore, ghouls belong to a diabolical class of jinns and were said to be the offspring of Iblis. Okay, so that's interesting. The Prince of Darkness in Islam. So now we see this Iblis connection again. They were capable of constantly changing form, but their presence was always recognized by their unalterable sign, ass's hooves. So in other words, they have donkey feet. For this, we see like the Bavin Shi, for example, in Scotland. That was it was the idea of these beautiful women that lure these men in, but then when they're dancing with them, when they have their dresses on, when their dresses move and they can see that they have the feet of animals, that's when you're not dealing with a human. And in this case, those spirits are vampiric in nature. So yeah, there's definitely this idea. Certainly the animals' feet connect them to beings like satyrs or centaurs, for example, which are representations of that kind of bestial sexuality. And I don't mean bestiality. I just mean sexuality that is more lust-driven and is not driven by some pure ideal of love or whatever it is. It's just pure carnal enjoyment. So there's definitely that connection there. And of course, in monotheism, that is regarded as sinful. Now, if we think about cannibalism in a mythological sense, the mythology of cannibalism, there's usually it's usually conceived of in two different ways. So one has to do with the idea of expiating guilt. So when we talk about the sacrifice, Freud talks about this in Totem and Taboo, where you have this sort of animal sacrifice that goes on. Really, if you have a sacrifice of a person, usually in this case he's talking about the totem animal of a tribe who is killed and eaten, that in doing so, this is almost like a purging of the guilt of the tribe. Now, the most obvious example of this is receiving the Eucharist if you go to Mass. Whether you Catholicism or Anglicanism, anybody who has communion as part of their service, any liturgical aspect to the ritual, as opposed to Protestants who may be strictly scripture-based or strictly Bible-based. Maybe have 3 hours of sermons. You know what I mean? Within Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Anglicanism, you have the liturgy as the central, the idea of the transubstantiation, right? The transferring of bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus. That is an example of this type of cannibalism. It's the idea that you ingest what this is idea of body and blood, which is supposed to be magically transformed, and that in doing this, you not only release your sin or your guilt, but it's also a way of which one gains spiritual power or the power of Christ or whatever it is by ingesting this sacrificial victim. Okay. Now, of course, nobody really wants to necessarily think about it or couch it in those terms, especially if they belong to those religions. But that is pretty much what the rationale. That is the rationale, at least according to the psychology of the cannibalism in a mythical or religious context. Now, the other aspect of cannibalism is that it has to do with absorbing the power of another. So the idea, again, with Freud referring to the totem animal, is the idea that when one ritually kills and eats that animal, that they're absorbing the power of it. I have often pointed out that the idea of the birthday cake is also an example of this, because basically the person is celebrating the fact that they have lived another year, and the cake is sort of the stand-in for the person. Rather than eating the person and absorbing their power, you eat a slice of the cake instead, which is another representation of that, a symbolic representation. Yeah, you're not going to look at birthday cake the same way again, are you? But that's the idea. It's the idea that in cannibalizing another, one takes the power away of another. Okay. Within Greek myth, I talk about this. I have a whole lecture on cannibalism. My students are probably getting to it real soon. it has to do with just that. It's just the idea that oftentimes you will see these stories, like in the House of Atreus in particular. You have Tantalus, and then you have Atreus himself, who kills the son of Thyestes and cooks and kills him, and then serves it to his own father. Which is these are all parts of the stories of how the line gets corrupted. And of course, Tantalus cooks and kills his son Pelops and feeds him as a dish to the gods. And the gods, of course, I think nobody actually will touch the dish except for Demeter, who takes a bite out of his shoulder. But this is the crime that gets Tantalus confined eternally to eternal hunger and thirst in Tartarus, because of the way in which he offends the gods because the gods don't believe in human. There's human sacrifice, and the eating of human flesh is always taboo, at least in many of these cultures. I mean, I'm sure there are cultures where it's not taboo, but it's, generally speaking, that's considered to be taboo for many religious reasons and probably there's good biological reasons as well. But nonetheless, when you see this happening, it's the idea of somebody trying to undermine or take away the power. In Greek myth, it seems to be of another male. Usually it's the son. It's the father that's trying to almost reabsorb the power of the son, and usually to very disastrous results. This is, so you've got, but nonetheless, when you have this with the female archetype, the female cannibal, this is almost the idea of the mother energy reversing itself. So rather than being one that is birthing life and supporting and nurturing life, the opposite is happening. And so this gets us involved in what we call the devouring mother or the terrible mother archetype. And I'm actually going to probably end this podcast reading you a bit on that from Erich Neumann, because I found my copy of The Great Mother. I knew I had it somewhere on the shelves in my house while I was doing something. I was like, oh, there it is. So I can actually read to you from his chapter on the negative elementary character of the mother. So I will do that later. Let's just talk about the Si'lat for a moment. Okay, so this idea of her being a very attractive woman who draws somebody in. Now, as we can see, the Si'lat sometimes engages in traditional marriage and bears children. Although, when she sees the lightning, it's interesting, because this way lightning is interpreted as a fire in the air, right? So you see this fire-air phenomenon. And interestingly, it is the main deities of a lot of Western religions, whether you're talking about Zeus, Jupiter, Jove, Yahweh. But you also see it in figures like Lugh in the Celtic, and you also see it like figures like Indra, who's king of the gods in Hinduism. They all wield the lightning bolt. And when the god that wields the lightning bolt, you notice it's a male god that wields the power of the lightning bolt. So this is this power almost of air and fire together. So just interesting association there. But the Si'lat is considered to be part of this sort of tribe of Jinn. And so she does occasionally fall in love with men fall in love with her, and in this case there seems to have been a whole tribe, and again, there's nothing recorded that says that the tribe is viewed as being auspicious or inauspicious, that it's good or bad, that they are children of this half jinn, half human children. It'd be interesting to know how that tribe might have been conceived by others. I don't know if they were conceived of having special powers or whatever. I mean, there's not a whole lot that's written there, at least not that I have access to at the moment. But that is interesting. Nonetheless, it's sort of what I said before about this idea of this loose or foreign woman that's going to lead a woman to destruction. So we're still seeing this kind of female trickster archetype. Now, the Si'lat in a piece that I read, they compare her to Maya. Now, Maya in Hinduism, Maya is just a state of illusion. That is the state of believing that what we see in front of our eyes is all that there is. It indicates that there is a reality that is beyond just what we experience in 3 dimensions and with our senses. But in this case, Maya is almost being treated. Maya sometimes is seen as a negative being because it has this illusoriness of the temporal world, makes someone think that the only thing that they should be striving for are material gains. So again, this idea of looking at a woman and falling in love, that this is something that one pursuing that perhaps to the exclusion of other things. The way in which falling in love operates. I've talked a lot about the anima, the projection of the anima as by the man, projecting it onto the woman that they fall in love with. It's the way in which this almost this feminine aspect of the soul can draw a man in and make him behave irrationally or against the rules of something, because the desire for the woman becomes greater than the desire for other things. But again, there's this disavowal, and it gets back to the idea that women, by their nature, instead of recognizing, from Jungian perspective, okay, this would be saying that recognizing the anima as the archetype of the male soul, okay, that this female soul within the male, rather than the male owning that female soul or acknowledging that female soul, instead it gets projected outwards, and now it ends up becoming an almost demonic force because it ends up having a kind of power over the man. And instead, this is actually blamed on women. It's just, or women, or in this case, this would be blamed on someone who appears to be a woman, but actually is this deceptive Jinn of a certain type. And this again is a disavowal. This is part of the narrative that will justify when a woman is assaulted, to say, oh, well, yes, but what did she do to cause that temptation? When you hear that kind of a thing, it's coming out of that kind of narrative that suggests that this feminine power that's really the in at least in Jungian terms, and again, you can look at this other ways as well, but this idea of the soul projection as somehow being this evilness of the feminine or evilness of the female, instead of actually looking at it for what it is, which is a medium through which we can, through our connections to others, we can potentially enjoy life, enjoy love, and be inspired to do creative things or to create things. Instead, people treat it like it's a source of sin or a source of shame, and then they cut themselves off from it. And this is a problem that men have had for a long time, that they're, and it's not, I'm not saying the men themselves are inherently the problem, but this whole narrative that they have internalized and that is part of this culture, and it certainly is part of this monotheistic culture that says that connecting with that feminine side is somehow shameful or is going to lead you to this place. And that it's leading you to something illusory. And again, it's that disavowal of the world. Life here is bad. You have to strive for the next life, or you have to be spiritual, or you have to deny yourself everything, because that's really the right way to be. And those of you who have listened to this podcast for a while know that my opinion about that. And again, to say that doesn't mean that someone has to run out and be hedonistic and go crazy everywhere. I mean, that's not the sense of it. But the idea is that if you want to enjoy something in life, you should be able to enjoy it without feeling like you're a bad person. Okay, so anyway, that's the simplest way of thinking about it. But see, it's funny how you have this attribute to a woman who either shows feminine wiles. So there's the idea of manipulating somebody into something, into a particular type of encounter, which can be destructive. At least that's how it's portrayed in the stories. Or a woman who might be considered to be sexually independent or aggressive. And again, that's also considered to be a problematic or destructive element. So I'm going to finish up now with I have this chapter from Neumann, and I'm just going to read a bit from this. I'm only going to read like one page, maybe a page and a half. But just to give you an idea, to sum up what we're talking about when we talk about this devouring mother archetype, now that I've found this text. Okay, so this is Neumann talking here. He says, we have repeatedly called attention to the basic psychic fact that human consciousness is experienced as masculine, and that the masculine has identified itself with consciousness and growth wherever a patriarchal world has developed. On the other hand, as we have shown, the unconscious, that is, the psychic stratum from which consciousness arises in the course of human history, so potentially the collective unconscious in Jung's terms, and in the course of individual development, is experienced in relation to this consciousness, so this unconscious, is experienced as maternal and feminine. So this is when I say the unconscious is feminine and the conscious is masculine, this is where this theory comes from, and can probably be borne out in a lot of ways. So anyway, this does not mean that all unconscious contents appear symbolically as feminine. The unconscious contains masculine as well as feminine forces, tendencies, complexes, instincts, and archetypes, just as mythology has male and female gods, demons, spirits, animals, and so on. But in general, consciousness sees the unconscious symbolized as feminine and itself as masculine. The phases in the development of consciousness appear then as embryonic containment of the mother, as childlike dependence on the mother, as the relation of the beloved son to the great mother, and finally as the heroic struggle of the male hero against the great mother. Okay, that's the heroic myth of the West, and the development of consciousness where one moves away from the mother and develops independence. I've talked about this many times. In other words, the dialectical relation of consciousness to the unconscious takes the symbolic mythological form of a struggle between the maternal feminine and the male child, And here, the growing strength of the male corresponds to the increasing power of consciousness in human development, right, where one moves from being in this symbolic, imaginative world of the unconscious into the rational world of the conscious mind. Since the liberation of the male consciousness from the feminine maternal unconscious is a hard and painful struggle for all mankind, or all humankind, we should say, Neumann wrote this a long time ago, it is clear that the negative elementary character of the feminine does not spring from an anxiety complex of the men, but expresses an archetypal experience of the whole species, male and female alike. For insofar as the woman participates in this development of consciousness, she too has a symbolically male consciousness and may experience the unconscious as negatively feminine. The symbolism of the terrible mother draws its images predominantly from the inside. That is to say, the negative elementary character of the feminine expresses itself in fantastic and chimerical images that do not originate in the outside world. The reason for this is that the terrible female is a symbol for the unconscious, and the dark side of the terrible mother takes the form of monsters, whether in Egypt, India, Mexico, Etruria, Bali, or Rome. In the myths and tales of all people, ages, and countries, even in the nightmares of our own nights, witches and vampires, ghouls and specters assail us all terrifyingly alike. The dark half of the black and white cosmic egg, representing the archetypal feminine, engenders terrible figures that manifest the black abysmal side of life and the human psyche, just as world, life, nature, and soul have been experienced as generative and nourishing, protecting and warming femininity, so their opposites are also perceived in the image of the feminine. Death and destruction, danger and distress, hunger and nakedness appear as a helplessness in the presence of the dark and terrible mother. Thus the womb of the earth becomes the deadly devouring maw of the underworld, and besides the fecundated womb and the protecting cave of earth and mountain, gapes the abyss of hell, the dark hole of the depths, the devouring womb of the grave, and of death, of darkness without light, of nothingness. For this the woman who generates life and all living things on earth is the same as those who takes them back into herself, who pursues her victims and captures them with snare and net. And yeah, this is a part of living in the field of time. You know you're eventually, from dust you came, and so dust you shall return. Disease, hunger, hardship, war, above all, are her helpers. Aha, there we go. He acknowledges war as being connected to her. And among all peoples, the goddesses of war and the hunt express human experience of life as a female exacting blood. This terrible mother is the hungry earth, which devours its own children and fattens on their corpses. There's that ghoul image. It is the tiger and the vulture and the coffin, the flesh-eating sarcophagus, voraciously licking up blood and seed of men and beasts, once fecundated and sated, casting it out again in new birth, hurling it to death over and over again to death. And this may also be why there's a strong sexual component, because if sex is considered to be something that draws in life, or it creates life, then when this succubus-type figure engages in sexual, either for pleasure's sake only, and not to bring new life, or creates a different kind of a life of her own, which they consider to be not correct or demonic or weak in some fashion or diseased in some fashion, as we see with the idea of changelings or the idea of the children of succubi and things like that, then we can also see how this connects in with this kind of life-death instinct that Neumann is talking about. So the feminine that is both life-giver and death-giver. So interesting to look at this. This has been a very, very long episode, longer than I wanted it to be. I think we can be clear on how these particular, at least the feminine expressions of Jinn, fit into the narratives that we see in the West. And there's there's a lot more that could be said. There are a lot of stories even about Jinn appearing to these days. There's people who have alleged to have caught them on camera and so forth, just like I've talked about with some of the folkloric figures in England and in Scotland and other places where people have, claimed to still have encounters with those kinds of beings. Yeah, you still have that, but certainly, and again, I don't want to divert into how real or not real are these beings. There's a psychological reality, and there's certainly in terms of being a natural force, there is certainly another type of reality as well. So interesting to think about. And of course, if you have comments or thoughts on the subject of Jinn, I'd be glad to hear them. Thanks so much for listening. As I'd mentioned in the beginning, I'm going to thank my patrons again in the end. If you would like to join my Patreon, it's patreon.com/Chthonia. My website with my podcast information and all my publications and other work is listed at chthonia.net. And my social media is Chthonia Podcast, one word on, I'm always saying Twitter. Now I guess it's X, and Instagram, and 2 words on Facebook. Thanks so much again for joining me, and till next episode.